It was a circuitous route that brought me here, I think. But in the end, I spent 25 years in the U.S. Air Force, and a large part of why I went there was because I came from a family that was very service oriented, teachers and journalists and people in the public health professions. And my grandfather was also in the Army Air Corps in World War II. And as I served around the world, beginning just after the fall of the Berlin Wall, I was involved in conflict zones, peace and stability operations, humanitarian operations, and in the mid 2000s, I was a detachment leader of an international coalition force in a peacekeeping operation, and I was sitting talking with a civic leader, a community leader of one of the battling ethnic groups, and he was telling me about the fact that his side was extraordinarily kind and peaceful and would reach out and help anyone and give you the shirt off their back. And when I asked him about the other side, he very blithely just said, "Oh, they're not even like humans. They don't deserve to be helped in any case. If I saw someone in the street in need of help, I wouldn't even help them." And I was struck by the contrast there, and and then I came home several days later on emergency leave because my aunt had passed away. And I found that people within my own family at the celebration of life couldn't talk to one another anymore because of political differences. And that was 20 years ago. It's so much more worse in the intervening years. And I feel that having left a military career of service orientation, I was looking for another purpose and really wanted to get involved in something like citizens' assemblies where there is a deliberate effort. And one of the objectives and outcomes that we're all looking for is to bridge divides and to depolarize our societies and mend our social fabric. And that's how I decided to just not sit on the sidelines and get started here in Deschutes County. I think I won't overgeneralize, but in general, citizens assemblies require, although in many ways here it was an unheard of type of process, and deliberative democracy wasn't really something that was known either within community leadership or within the broader populace. And because of that, you probably need a lot of external assistance like that of DemocracyNext and Healthy Democracy, who came in and gave us a lot of best practices and the sort of the playbook on how to set something up. But none of it can really happen unless there is at least one focal point in the middle of it organizing locally. And we've seen that in assemblies around country here and further abroad. And so I was sort of that. I was the local organizer who was able to engage with various stakeholders here, get agreements from local elected officials and administrators, and also have just sit down conversations with people and groups in their homes, with local civic groups like Rotary clubs and veterans groups, and from sort of the um, planting of the seed when Claudia came here to talk about it at a conference at the university to 18 months later when we had the assembly closing up and we were presenting to local officials. I was sort of at the middle of all of that. We had to have, in fact, that was our prerequisite before we even started to organize or fundraise, that we had a firm commitment from our local elected officials to follow through. And I have to say they've done a tremendous job. Immediately in the 2 to 3 months after the assembly, delegates and I went around to all of the elected bodies and made presentations about the recommendations. And afterward, we waited till sort of had that break for the holidays. And then during the spring, the county commission, the city council had numerous public meetings where they discussed with staff who are working on identifying which of the recommendations applied to their jurisdictions and their authorities, and then what they might have already been doing and what they would do. And in the spring, April, May, both of those entities issued formal responses, and they talked about some of the priorities and um, how they might take action further on. The cities had actually sort of a firm action plan. The county was a bit less direct and detailed. And then to our surprise, the our local school district also issued a formal response, which we hadn't asked them to in advance, but it turned out that so much of the topical policy aspects actually applied to schools that they decided on their own to chime in, which we were really impressed by. And finally, something we didn't expect at all, several of our state representatives from our local region co-sponsored new legislation at the state level for Oregon to increase resources for youth homelessness. And they told us directly that they were inspired in part by the assembly. So there's this real arc of, like you said, someone getting a letter in the mail, and 9 months later, here they were seeing their words and their policies and recommendations being put directly into work. Now, we won't see the direct outcomes of those for quite a while, probably. This is a really thorny challenge, but the fact that that's happening has inspired a lot more action and participation here locally. I'll start with the first part. It was quite emotional. You're right. And I was particularly stricken, and a lot of the organizers discussed on the sidelines just how many of the delegates, at least, I think at least a third of them, had some personal experience, either they themselves or members of their family who had some experience with homelessness, either when they were young or later in life. And because of that, we anticipated the potential for there to be some trauma. So we did have trauma-informed moderators who were there to be able to help facilitate. There were a lot of tears, and there was also laughter. I mean, I think one of the things that galvanized the group more than anything was that we partnered with and brought in a group of young leaders from the community, the Youth Action Board, who have all experienced homelessness, and they told their personal stories. And it's hard to sit and think about what you've heard on a podcast about why homelessness exists when you've got someone telling you right in front of you. And that really brought people together, people's own struggles. Um, we have been keeping in touch very much. I think I've probably talked directly with about half of the assembly members within the last couple of months. Our university partner, Oregon State University Cascades, and I brought back together about a third of them 2 weeks ago to sort of gauge how they feel a year on. And their responses were really powerful. And I'll start with kind of, our three objectives here were to have better governance and policies around youth homelessness. Another, to help build our civic spirit and capacity locally. And then the other was to kind of mend that social fabric that I talked about, bridge divisions. And the governance side we've talked about, although I will say they were a little underwhelmed by the county's response. They wanted more there, but the cities they were pleased by, but they're still sitting back and with a let's continue pushing attitude. Civic spirit and capacity, all of them are involved in some way in ways that they weren't before. Most of them hadn't been volunteering previously. Some had worked in service organizations, but now all of them were.
Wow.
And then they anticipate doing more. And they're also asking, when's the next civic assembly going to be? We want to be involved. And then finally, on that mending the social fabric side, is really powerful. The videos that you can see show on the very last day of the assembly members talking about what a transformational experience this was and how they never felt like they had a voice before, but now they did, or how they suddenly found that they could trust one another and solve problems with people of varying and vast differences in their backgrounds. And we wondered if that was going to stick around 9 months later. And they said absolutely 100% that hasn't changed. They still would look to their neighbors and other people in the community to solve big challenges in ways that they wouldn't have before. Well, there's so many. It is hard to choose. I think there was a moment at the beginning of the second weekend, and I'll backtrack just a little bit to focus just more broadly on the diversity of the group that we had together. On day one, sitting around the table as they were introducing one another, we did that for an icebreaker. We had a high school student sitting next to an 84-year-old retired riverboat captain from the Columbia River, and we had an elk hunter who works at an ammunition manufacturing plant sitting next to a vegan acupuncturist. And you could see this like, what, where have I wound up here? This is so strange. But the one question after they formed a charter and really began to work well together that they kept asking is, how do we know that this actually is going to go anywhere, that this is meaningful? And to answer those questions, we did have local elected officials, the mayor and county commissioners come in and talk. But the one moment that really struck me was the beginning of, I think, the third day. We had on the stage together talking about the importance of this process, an elected Democratic city councilor and an elected Republican county commissioner. And both erstwhile public servants, but remember, this was a month and a half before our very contentious national election. And the two of them stood on the stage together and just talked about the importance of community service and being here. And it would really impressed upon me the ability of citizens assemblies to bring people together in consequential ways and that seem to be missing so much from our public dialogue right now. In the design for the assembly, we did put in a brief portion toward the end to sort of help the group self-organize for what they would do afterward, and gave a couple of spreadsheets. People signed up to either be more involved in pushing for policy follow-through or for really being involved in the public communications and talking to the community about the process and what they'd experienced. I have continued as sort of the organizer here locally. We call this the Central Oregon Civic Action Project. I've continued to assist them, um, but they've remained involved. Several of them have done interviews with local news sources, both in print and broadcast. And as I mentioned before, many of the delegates have showed up at the public meetings to ensure that their voices were heard more directly, not just via the recommendations. The one thing I say would be a big lesson learned is I would love to have dedicated more time during the assembly to actually helping them self-organize. I think me being in the middle of it as the process person is not ideal. I'd love to have empowered them a bit more to have one another's contact information and to be able to sort of designate their own leadership to follow through. But we've just began to do that. The university is assisting, so they're continuing on to this day. No, no, we're absolutely. There are a number of different entities within the community that truly are committed to holding more assemblies. And this also was, I think, a critical aspect of DemNext's participation, guidance, and leadership. From the get-go, we said this won't be just a one-off assembly. We're going to simultaneously plan and formulate a strategy to have some long-lasting civic infrastructure to hold more. Its city of Bend has just talked about holding an assembly to help with their long-term strategic planning. The county has talked about a variety of different topics to potentially touch on. Meanwhile, we're talking with community leaders, both elected and civic leaders in the smaller communities around Bend. So that's where we're really trying to help build more connections and civic engagement. And there are also our local museum is talking about doing so. Talking with, I've presented this topic to several of the um, kindergarten through 12th grade school groups here, and the school district has talked about using that for selection processes as well. So it is permeating through the community quite nicely. I think to me, and thanks for pointing out that quote. That's actually become our kind of our vision statement and mission, all encapsulated into one for CoCap. And it's, I think, key that you can't do that with just one citizens assembly. I mean, it did impact many people directly, but we're a large community. We've got a couple 100,000 people spread out over a large area, very diverse. And this is a marathon. It's not a sprint. We'll be working to continue to build those. Fascinatingly, at first, I thought I was going to be planning to form a civic engagement hub that would be strictly for assemblies. And we're very fortunate to have a strong partner in our local Council of Governments in building that. What I found though is there's a lot of energy in this community around building a broader civic engagement hub that can help with collaboration, with sharing of scarce resources, and bring people together in ways that are innovative, including civic assembly. So I think Civic Assembly Hub is actually now going to be part of a broader civic engagement hub that will allow that connective tissue and that civic strength to be deepened as we move on. So we're excited. Fundraising, of course, and building the structure are the next steps. But we've got a lot of great community partners involved. As we look to what we're doing here in Deschutes County and Central Oregon, we're very cognizant that what we do will be seen and hopefully mirrored or used to some extent by other communities. So we're trying to build something in mind the idea that it be scalable, that it be replicable. While of course totally understanding that the context is different in different geographies and different populations, but what we do here is also being looked at by our state government to see if they might develop some sort of legislation and funding to support assemblies in other parts of the state. And because of the great communications assistance that we had from DemNext and others, with all the videos and articles that are out there, I get contacted routinely by civic leaders around the country asking for advice and how they might do something similar in their communities. So I think the spirit of sort of this being a catalyst for greater innovation and democratic growth and strengthening around the country is also at the forefront for us. It's so fascinating to see across the body of work of all citizens assemblies, like how the topic drives the public response and attitude toward it. And, Fort Collins was interestingly what seems like a pretty mundane topic, what to do with a piece of land. But wow, when I talked with Healthy Democracy afterwards, I mean the amount of conflict and real passion around it is, you were reminded that it doesn't have to be a deeply personal, humanistic sort of topic like youth homelessness to really have the people's attention and to help solve long-standing problems that's been around for decades. And so that to me shows when we can tell that story well and let people understand that, a bunch of groups that have deeply entrenched positions can come together and learn from being together and have that expert but light facilitation and just start to talk as human beings, the differences that can be made and the progress that can be made, and finding a way to tell that story that inspires different types of communities, I think is one of our great tasks moving forward. But the fact that there are more and more of them springing up really excites me.
Yeah.
Um, I will say I talk not to be a downer or a cynic, but it also concerns me a little bit because it seems as if in this day and age of troll farms and bots and nasty bloggers or podcasters that when something good starts to really take shape, that's when the attack dogs start to turn on it. And so I want us to all be cognizant and have kind of be putting out the positive message, but also the message that this is not a progressive only or a conservative only effort. It is just us as humans figuring out how to be together and solve problems together.